Hey everybody, I'm Robert Donovan. Welcome to this episode of Not Trekonomics. I apologize for the dearth of content the last few months. We are starting off the new year a little bit behind. I owe you guys some tutorials in Blender and a couple of videos. So I was really sick a couple of months ago, been playing catch up ever since. It just put me behind on a bunch of different things. So in the interest of getting caught up with what I wanted to do on this channel, we are going to do my take on a Star Wars Hyperspace jump effect, and we're going to do that this episode. We're going to break it into three parts. The first part is going to be the streaky stars effect here. The second part will be the hyperspace tunnel and the emergence therefrom back into normal space. And then the third one will be, we're going to render those as two separate clips, and the third one will be putting those two clips together in the video sequence editor. So we're going to go ahead and kill this, kill this because we don't need it anymore. And let's open up a new scene in Blender. Okay, first thing we're going to do, make sure you're in Cycles Render. Alrighty, next thing we need to do is make sure we have a couple of add-ons turned on. So click the menu button down here, go to User Preferences, and over here we want to do the Loop Tools add-on. So just type Loop in the search bar over here. That'll be the first one at the top. Make sure that's checked. Next one we need is the Node Wrangler. So if you go N-O-D-E, I forgot the O there, you go N-O-D-E, that will bring up the Node Wrangler. Make sure that is checked. I recommend clicking Save User Settings each time, save user settings so they will be turned on each time you start Blender. They're just very, very useful, and I use them all the time. For those of you wondering why my color scheme doesn't look like yours, that's because I have a different theme selected. Under Themes, I have the Science Lab preset enabled. That is my personal preference. You do not have to do that for this tutorial. Moving on, back to 3D view. Next thing we want to do is get the scene and render and world settings all set up for this. So we are going to go to the Render tab first, and we want to set the frame rate to 30. Actually, I want to set the frame rate to 30. You can set it at whatever you like. Turn on border rendering, and for the output, you want that to be any place other than temp, because temp just isn't a great place to have your output going when you're rendering in Blender. You can render this to stills, or you can render it to an MP4. It's a fairly short clip, so it wouldn't really make a difference. I prefer stills, but if you wanted to do rendering to an MP4, just click PNG, click FFmpeg video, click RGB to make sure it renders in color, and then under here click encoding, and Blender can render to any of these video formats you see here. I usually go with MP4, and that takes care of all of that. I do generally, though, prefer to just render to PNG stills, and you don't really need RGBA. I just do that because it's the default. So under sampling, we're going to be using emission shaders, which don't really interact with light, so I'm going to knock the sampling rate down pretty darn low. I'm going to go to like 32 and 10. You can probably get away with even lower than that, but that's good enough for me. And under light paths here, we are in space. So I'm going to set the light bounces max and min to 4 and turn off reflective and refractive caustics because you don't really need them. We will be turning on motion blur for this, and we want a lot of it. Set the shutter to 0.85. And that pretty much takes care of everything we will need to worry about here. Under the scene settings here, click on passes. This tutorial was inspired by a tutorial that Darkfall did, and I have taken that as a starting point really and added a bunch of stuff to it. One of them requires we turn on material indices, and so that's where we do that here. Then go to the scene settings here, and I like to set my measurement units to metric. That's a personal preference. You don't have to do that, but we do want to turn off gravity. We're going to be using a particle system here, and we don't want gravity on because we're in space. And that will be that for those settings. Under the world settings, we will be adding a star field background to the world background later on, an environment texture. But for the moment, setting up the basic effect, you're better off just taking the world to basic black, and we'll deal with the star field addition later on. Under camera settings, finally, we want to set the end clipping from 100 to 500 be that Blender units or meters. Okay, let's go back to the render tab here just to make sure we've got we're in a uniform place. Now we need to set and position the camera. So numpad 7 to go to top view, numpad 5 to go to top orthographic view. And you can select the camera. If you hit A, I've actually deleted the default cube and the default lamp. All you have to do is just select something, hit X, and then hit delete to delete it. I don't want to delete the camera, so just delete the default cube. And let's see here. If we go to if you have your Blender scene set up where the camera is the default, where it's like this, where it's like rotated a little like this and looking down at the center of the scene like that. All you have to do to fix that is go Alt-R, Alt-G, and then hit RX90, enter, and you've got what I have for my default scene. Okay, back to numpad 7, back to numpad 5, there. Okay, so with this camera selected any way you want to do it, hit G to grab, Y to constrain to the Y-axis, and then type -120. Zoom out using the mouse wheel, and shift middle mouse button to pan like this. We're going to keep going because it's a big scene. There we go. Now let's increase the size of the camera. Hit S and then to scale, and then 3, and then enter. That makes the camera easier to see. Now going to numpad 0 to look through the camera. We need to add a plane. Shift A, mesh, and plane. And we want to rotate that 90 degrees on the x-axis, RX90, enter. And now we're looking square on at the plane. We want to scale it up till it fills the camera view. Hit S to scale, and then just pull your cursor out from the origin until the plane fills the camera view like that. We now want to add some geometry to this plane, so hit Tab to go into edit mode, click down here to go into face select mode, press the W key to go into your specials menu, and click subdivide. Under the subdivide category that comes up over here on the tool shelf, when you do that, set the number of cuts to 7, and that gives us the number of faces that will make this work well. We now just want to select this outer perimeter of faces, so hit A to deselect everything. Put your mouse cursor in the center of any of these vertical lines. Do Shift Alt right click, do that on the bottom as well. And then in the center of this horizontal line on the side here, Shift Alt right click, Shift Alt right click. And now we want to make this a circle, and that's where the Loop Tools add-on comes in. In the Tool tab up here, select that if it isn't already, should be the default. And then open up Loop Tools, scroll down, and click Circle. And with Circle clicked, you now have made a square into a circle. Hit A to deselect, hit Tab to go back into Object View. The next step, we need to add a particle system to this plane. Before we do that, though, let's name the plane. We're going to call it Starfield Layer 1, or L1. So Starfield L1. And then we're going to go to the Particle System tab, click New, and we're going to name this Starfield L1. Okay. Then the type will be emitter. The number of particles will be 1,000. This is currently set up, you'll see one particle here, to start emitting particles at frame 1, stop emitting particles at frame 200, and each particle has a lifetime of 50 frames. We want to set the end clipping value to 1 because we want all the particles to show up at once. We want the lifetime to be 100. And I'm going to set the end animation frame value to 120 down here. And then that will take care of that part of it. Now under velocity, if you go to numpad 7 and press play, you'll see that when the particles get created, they are thrust away from the face of the faces of the plane. We want them not to do that, and the way you fix that is set this normal value to 0, go back to numpad 0, to go into the camera view. With the normal set at 0, if you click play, now they won't do anything. They're just sitting there like that. Go back to the beginning. And under physics, we want to set the size to 0.08. Under render, we do not want to render the plane, we just want to render the particles, so uncheck emitter. And then here under object, If we were to just render this now, we would not get anything because these particles you're seeing here are just placeholders. We need to tell cycles or give cycles an object to use as the particles. So we are just going to do Shift-A, Mesh, and add an icosphere. To that icosphere, we're going to add a basic emission material so it will emit light. Click New, click Diffuse, click Emission, and set the strength value to 5. Now go back to the star field plane here. Left-click there to select that. And on the star field tab for the star field L1 plane, we now have the object selected. If you click this cube, you can now select the icosphere. And if you zoom in, you'll see here's the big icosphere in the center. We'll deal with that momentarily, but well, in a little bit. And you'll see we have particles that are all icospheres, but they're all exactly the same size. Take random size to 1, and now you'll see they're all different sizes. And so now we can zoom back out here. So that takes care of adding the particle system that is stuck to the front of the plane. We now need to make it move. Hit numpad 3. We want to add a force field to do this. So Shift-A and go to force field. And we want to use wind for this. And we're going to go ahead, hit G to grab, hit Y to constrain to the Y-axis, and 10. And if we name this thing wind over here, and then zoom in, well, pan and zoom in here. Okay, we have a little arrow pointing up here. We want to rotate that on the x-axis 90 degrees, RX90. And if we zoom back out and press play, you'll see that it is now giving a nice gentle breeze and blowing the particles away. They're not going as fast as we want. So let's go back to the beginning, and with the wind selected, we will go to the physics tab. We actually want to animate this. So we're on frame 1, and at frame 1 we want the strength of the wind to be 0. And then hit I to keyframe it. And at about frame 30, we still want the wind to be 0. So hit I to keyframe that again. And at frame 120, we want the wind strength to be about 300. And hit I to keyframe that. So now, when we go back to frame 1 and go into numpad 7 here, this will be easier to see. And we'll get the whole thing into the view here. If we press play, you see it till about frame 30, and then they just blast by the, let's see how far we got here. There we go, 94, they're not quite there. 95, so we need to make the wind just a tiny bit stronger, I think, but we'll add one more effect. We want these things to bunch up towards the center as they get towards the camera, and then blast by the camera all bunched up. So let's go back to the beginning, go to numpad 3, Shift-A, force field, magnetic, and then do GY11. We want to rotate this on the x-axis 90 degrees, so hit RX90, and that'll make it bunch up in the center. If we go to numpad 7 and press play now, yeah, see they're bunching up right before they get to the camera, and they're still taking a while to get to the camera. We may need to increase the speed of the wind just a little bit. But we're going to duplicate this plane first before we do that. So let's go back to the beginning here, go to numpad 3, and select starfield L1. We want to duplicate this plane now that we've got the particles created the way we want them. And so do Shift-D, hit the Y key, and then hit the 4 key on the keyboard, and then hit Enter. And now if we go to the now we've got a Starfield 001 here, and if you go to the Particle System tab, one thing to note, we have a Starfield L1 particle system on the Starfield L1 001 plane, which means this plane, the second duplicated plane, has the same particle system as the first one. We don't want to do that. Click 2 to make that its own particle system, and then rename everything to L2. And that includes this thing right here, and rename that. just to make sure that all the particle systems and particle system names agree with the names of their respective planes. Now go back to the particle system tab and set the seed value to 15. That makes a different pattern of stars on the second plane so that they're not all in the same position on both planes. And we're going to do that one more time. Shift, D, Y, 4, enter, and go through that same thing again. Hit 2, make this L3, set your seed value this time to 30. We'll just do that right there, and then set this to L3 here. And then go back to numpad 0. Whoops, numpad 0 in the view screen here. And we want to select Starfield L1, hit S to scale, and then do 0.85. That will cause the particles on that first plane to bunch up a little more concentratedly in the center. All right, go to numpad 7, so we're at the top here. And now if we press play, yes, see we have this nice little, if you go to numpad 0, you have this nice little blizzard of stars going right by the camera there, and that's exactly what we want. It is I wanted to do it at about frame 90, and it's about frame 98 now, so we're going to have to go back to the beginning here, and we will go into the wind, the physics, and we will go to frame 120, just click the end frame there, and we're going to change that. We're going to go ahead and delete that keyframe, and we're going to change that to 350. And hit I to keyframe it again, go back to the beginning, and let's see what we get here at around frame 90. All right, 86, 87, 88, 89. Okay, getting there. All right, 97, so we're going to need to take that wind speed up, or maybe not. Hang on, we got one thing we have to do here to fix that. So let's go to the back to the beginning here, and let's hit A to deselect everything, then hit A again to select everything. And let's go here to the graph editor real quickly. Hit H or home to do this, and we have the strength. Hit V and then select vector, which makes this a linear rather than a Bezier curve here. Now go back to 3D view and press, let's go to numpad 7 here and press play. Actually, let's deselect everything and just select the first starfield plane. And now press play. There we go. 87, 88, 99, 90, 1, 2. Yes, that will be just about right. I want this to be about 3 seconds to get past that camera. So that'll do just nicely. Okay, that takes care of getting everything animated the way we want it. Let's go back to the beginning, and we'll set this at frame 60 so that everything is moving, but it's not moving a whole bunch. One thing we do need to do here, we don't want the icosphere to render in the scene, so select the icosphere, hit M, and move it to layer 2 so it won't be rendered in the scene. Go to numpad 0 and hit F12 to give this thing a render. Okay, the render has finished, and you'll see what we've got. You got a little bit of motion blur on the stars there. It's just not very much, but you're just starting to see it. They're starting to bunch up in the center. That is exactly what we want. This is now a good time, A, to save your work, and I already saved this to a file, so I'm not going to do it again, but this is a good time to save your work, and now if you do, when you save your work, the next thing you want to do after that is, when you've saved your work, you want to add the star field into the background. So we now have this thing working the way we want. We kind of need to get the star field in there to add the effects in properly. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. Go back to 3D view. All right, go back to 3D view, go back to frame 1, And then we can go to the world view, the world settings here, click Use Nodes, and I'll leave a link in the description below where you can get this image. It's a 360-degree panoramic image of the Milky Way that I got from a file at blendswap.com. You can also find it on NASA, but I always have to dig around on NASA to find this thing. I'm not sure why it's so hard to find on NASA. You can also just find it on the internet. Just look up 360-degree panoramic Milky Way, and that'll probably get you there. But I'm going to go ahead and add this thing now, and it's the star field I use in most of my backgrounds. I'm going to be making some new backgrounds here in a few weeks, and we'll be dropping those in so that the backgrounds will vary a little bit. But anyway, we're going to do starfield 01 as the name of the file here, and that's the name I've given that file. And if we hit render again, this time on frame 60 again, and we will hit render again, and this time you will see the star field in the background with the stars, and this is where I really part company as far as how Darkfall did this versus the way I do this. Darkfall did not put the star field in, and his particles were going away from the camera, not toward it. But other than that, we basically copied Darkfall's tutorial up to this point. Okay, with that done, we want to go to the node editor, and we want to go to the scene compositing, click Use Nodes, click Backdrop, and then left-click Render Layers. That deselects the composite layer. And then do Control-Shift left-click, and that's where the Node Wrangler add-on comes in, because that's what enables us to do that. Hit N to get rid of that Properties panel there. We don't need it. And we're going to go move this over here. And there we go. Now, first thing we want to do is throw some lens distortion onto this thing. Shift-A and distort and lens distortion. Now this lens distortion thing is generally, I think the intent is to get rid of lens distortion that occurs from the curvature of a camera lens. We're going to use it to cause some lens distortion, and that's what gives us our streaky stars. And if you do the dispersion, and that I think is also known as barrel distortion. And so I've got that backwards. Let's do V and V and V. There, yeah, it's barrel distortion. And if you do distortion and take that to the negative side, you get this lovely little streaky stars effect with all these rainbow colors, which we do not want. So Shift-A, mesh, or not mesh, Shift-A, color, mesh. Shift-A, color, hue, saturation, value. And we want to get rid of the saturation to 0. That gets rid of all the color. And now we can put back in any color that we want. We're going to do a Shift-A, color, Rgb Curves. We will mess with the contrast just a little bit here. Good enough. You can play with this all day until you're happy with it, but that's good enough for this tutorial. And we're going to take the reds down about like that. Going to take the greens down, not quite so much. And we're going to take the blues up. Like that. Probably a little too much there, but this is another thing you can play with all day. Okay, good enough. That gets us our blue shifting that we are supposed to get when we start approaching the speed of light. And now we will do Shift-A, color brightness contrast. And we'll set this to 0.3, 0.4, 0.3, 0.5, something like that. 0.3, 0.6. We'll go with that. Okay, now we want to add the Sunbeams effect in. We're going to add a little bit of blur first, though, just to kind of give the sunbeams something to shine from here. So go Filter, Blur, drop that in. We want this to be fast Gaussian and relative aspect correction on the X. And let's do 0.5 and see what we get here. We'll probably need to take the size down a little bit here. Yep. Take down about 0.7-ish. Yeah, 0.7 looks good to me. Maybe a 0.6 if we're feeling that kind of way. Anyway, you have that. Yeah, we'll leave a 0.6. And now let's throw in the sunbeams here. Let's move all these over just a little bit here. And do Shift-A, filter sunbeams. And we need an add node for this thing too. So Shift-A, color mix. And we're going to set the mix mode to add. And let's see, we want to drop this in here. We want to take this in here. And we want to take the modified image there. And that gets us this. Now, if we take the ray length here up to 1, okay, we now get sort of this bathed in light effect, which I think just makes this thing work really, really well. And that gets us that. At this point, we have essentially copied the node structure that Darkfall used for his system. The difference now is that since I have introduced a star field, I have introduced a couple of complications that he didn't have to deal with just using a particle system as the star field. And that is, we don't want the effects to be on. When you don't have the star field there, you can have these effects as they're set right now the entire time. You don't need to leave them, you don't need to animate them to turn them off or on at different points in the scene. But with the star field, you do. In the initial part, we don't want any effects turned on because for the first second or so, we're looking at a regular star field. So what I want to do here is animate all of these at frame, let's go back to frame 1. So the first thing we want to do here is we want to take the lens distortion to 0. And then we want to keyframe that. Okay, so that, hit I, hit I. All right, now, we don't want the coloring effects on at the beginning either. So we're going to take the factor on the hue saturation value to 0. Okay, and hit I. And we're going to take the factor on the Rgb curves to 0 and hit I. And we're going to take the ray length to 0.001. Ray length, when you animate it, it tends to go on. It kind of flickers on, and that doesn't look very realistic. So we're going to just hit it at 0.001 and hit I. So that takes care of everything except the blur on the stars. And now we're going to take the size from 0.6 to 0 on the blur and keyframe that. So now we basically, and at the start of this, you won't have any motion blur on the particles, so you won't see this. So that's what we're looking at, is we're looking at the stars in the system, in the star field, and the bright contrast we can leave because it doesn't make that much difference. But that is the initial effect we're looking at there. We don't want anything basically fancy turned on. The next thing we want to do is now we want to start, as the scene progresses, we want this thing to start doing stuff. So from frame 0 to frame 30, so go to about frame 30, I don't want anything to change except maybe the sunbeams to start going on and the blue shifting to start occurring. We don't want the major lens distortion to happen right from the beginning because we're not going that fast yet. It'll take, we're only talking about a second here. So the ray length here, we're going to, well, actually, let's start over here. So the hue saturation value, as of frame 30, we want all this stuff to be 0. So keyframe all this stuff at 0. Keyframe this at 0. This one, do I want that at 0 or not? Do I want that to start going? I think what I'm going to do is we'll set that to 0. we will set this to 0, because the lens distortion isn't happening yet. We're not going to get the rainbow effect. So hit I to keyframe that to 0, and keyframe this to 0, and keyframe, and this we want different. This at by frame 90, we want this in full effect. So up to frame 90, we're going to take this to 1 and then hit I there. So we want that going pretty much from the moment this thing starts. Okay, so go back to the beginning. Okay, so now we're going to go to frame 30, which is where everything is basically still. So now we're getting just a little bit of the lens, the sunbeams happening here. And then we're going to have the, you know what, we probably want to get the blue shifting going at that point too. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and set this to, let's go ahead and delete this keyframe, or let's just go ahead and set this to 1, and then right click and replace that keyframe. Do the same thing here, set this to 1, right click and replace that keyframe. So now we have all the bluishness going on here. And let's set the blur size to 0.6 by this point too, because we're moving. We want the blur to be in there by that point. All right, so let's do that. Set the blur size to 0.6 and right click and replace the keyframe. Okay, so we're getting just a little bit of blur. That will get us where we need to go, and then the sunbeams and the lens distortion here by frame 90. When this thing is hitting the camera, we want the lens distortion to be all the way this way, and all the way minus and all on the distort, and all the way positive on the disperse. Zoom that in so you can see it a little bit better, and then hit I and keyframe those. So what you're going to see is the sunbeam effect starts getting the initial effect, and then the blue shifting occurs, and then the lens distortion starts happening. So that, I think, will be and I will put all the animation settings in the description below so that you can copy them from there and not have to work so hard at getting this here. But there we have that. So that is the initial animation for the main scene. The next thing, though, is I wanted to put a secondary effect on the particles themselves, and that's why I turned on this pass index, and that's why we've got this index MA over here. So what we're going to do is Shift A, converter, Shift A, converter, try that again, IDmask. Take this, take the index MA value into the input for the ID value, and if we go Shift Control left click, take that to the viewer, what you're seeing here is all of if you go back to frame 1 or frame 60 here before there's not quite so much, what you're seeing here is the whole scene. If we go to frame 1, whoops, did I not do a pass index for the particles? Did I forget to do that, I wonder? Yes, I did. All right, sorry folks, made a mistake there. When you create the emission material on the icosphere, set the pass index to 1. Sorry about that. Now I've got to re-render this thing. All right, let's go back into the node editor here. Now we see the stars in, okay, so let's go back here and show you what's going on. In index 0, that's the whole scene by default, gets index 0. The black bits are all the parts that are not index 0, which are the stars. Let's turn on anti-aliasing. Makes a few more of them show up. And so what we want to do now is isolate the stars so that we can put effects just on the particles and not on the rest of the scene as a whole. And we're going to do that with a mix node. So Shift A, color, mix. Drop that in here. You want the mask as the factor. You want the original image going in on the bottom. This top input set to black. And now we can put effects on the stars that don't affect the rest of the scene. So Shift A, and one of the the only one I usually do for this, when I'm doing this with this Hyperspace effect, is I will put the glare node on there. And one of the cool things, if you're doing a still, is to put the streaks on there. And you can then do some basic color correction or some, play with the color a little bit if you do Rgb Curves. And you can sort of play with the contrast a little bit and do something like that. And if you do that, and then if we take the, let's take the greens down, let's go take the reds up and make them red like that. And you can take the blues down, make them give them a more warmer color there, like that. We take the greens up a little bit here. There you go. And so now you can do that. That's good for a still or kind of a stylized, sort of a poster kind of thing. But we want an animation. We don't want to really do that. So let's do Control X, get rid of this. And we're going to change this from streaks to fog glow. And the fog glow is already not bad. We're going to set the threshold to 0.8. And we're going to leave that like so. This is another one where we want to animate it. So if we're at, let's go to frame 1, and we want the size of the fog glow to be zilch, or as low as we can get it. 6 is good. And the threshold to be 1 rather, like that. So we're basically not getting anything. Hit I, and that will prevent you from getting any blur on the stars. When you get to frame 30, though, we want to set this to 0.8 and this to size of about 8, like that. Will do just fine. And then hit I and hit I, and that will take care of that. Let's go Shift A, and let's do Filter, Blur, Fast Gaussian, Relative Aspect Correction on the X, and let's just do 1% and 1% and knock the size down to about 0.4 or 5, somewhere in there. Okay, make it 0.4. 0.3. There we go. Very subtle effect there. We don't want a lot. Okay? And then, remember, these particles are going to be moving, so they will get a little motion blur imparted to them. So then we're going to add this image on top of this image here. We're going to just duplicate this add node, Shift D. And we want to put this image here. I'm going to drop this in here. And we want this image on the bottom. The output of this one going into the top. And now you've got these other stars in the background, and that's what gives you that effect of the stars in the background having the delayed reaction. And that's absolutely physically not correct, but in terms of stylization and making it look interesting, I think it adds quite a bit of visual interest to the effect. So that is the streaky stars effect that I did. So what you do now is render this out to either a sequence of stills or an MP4. And when you're done with that, you proceed to part 2, where we will make the hyperspace tunnel, and then we will put the two together in part 3. So thanks so much for watching. Welcome, by the way, to my new subscribers. I picked up a few this month. Welcome aboard. Always glad to have new subscribers. So there we are. Hope you found this interesting and or useful. More stuff to come. Going to be doing an announcement on what's coming for 2018. Just want to get this old stuff taken care of and out of the way first. So thanks again for watching, and may the balance of your day be awesome.